In this lecture, we will learn all about shadows. First of all, we'll learn how to make shadows appear, what are the criteria. Then we will learn the cast shadow options, the light transmission, to control the size, the shape, and the position of a shadow, what will affect them. And casting shadows on the floor, I'll take you through something very small. And then shadow darkness and diffusion. Let's go through the three main ingredients that are required for a shadow to appear. That's very easy. First of all, you need a layer that will receive the shadows. This is the layer on which you will see the shadows. This is called the layer accepting shadows. You need a layer that will cast the shadows. Of course, you need a light, and this light should be in front of the two layers. Another condition you need is a distance between the layer receiving the shadows and the layer casting the shadows. That's very important. Of course, in real life it's the same. If I go to my left view, you see that this is my background layer, this is the layer that is receiving the shadows, and this is the layer casting the shadows. And of course, I'm gonna put my light somewhere here. Let's go back to our active view, and let's create a light. We right click, new, and create new light. We can rename our light here and call it shadow light. That will be cool. Then we are going to use the point, which is easier than the others. The color, let's make it 100% white, and use the intensity at 130%. Leave fall off to none. And an important choice that you have to do here is to select cast shadows. If you don't select cast shadows, then there will be no shadows casted from this light. This light has to be set to cast shadows. The next one is shadow darkness. Let's leave it at 50%. And that's okay for now. I'll tell you how to change it later on the effects. Another important message here is you need to have a layer that is casting shadows and another layer that is accepting the shadows. That's the message all about. You can read it. Let's click OK. So now we have our light, but we don't have any shadows. And the light here, I can see it, I can move it, it's effective. So let's go to the background layer, press AA rapidly, and to get the material options, we notice that cast shadows is off, and that is the default. But for this background layer, we want cast shadows to be off, even though it's the default. Accept shadows is on, so that's okay for the background layer, and we want it to accept shadows. So we notice that the default are cast shadows off and accept shadows on. Let's go back to our shadows layer, the text layer. If we open AA, the material option, we notice that cast shadows is off. We set it to on, and the shadows will appear. Here you are, you have it in your main composition. There is another option here in cast shadows, and that is cast shadows only. That's pretty cool. The layer has disappeared, and the only thing you can see is the shadow. That is very useful where you want to see only the shadows. Let's put back this to on and look at light transmission. Light transmission is about getting the shadow to take the color of the layer. Let's put it at 100% and look at the effect. You notice that the shadow is taking the color of the layer. At 50%, of course, if you double click on light, you will see that shadow darkness is 50%. If you put the intensity at 100% to have it 100% legal and have the darkness a bit higher, you notice taking more the color. You go too much in the value, it will become black, of course, everything is darkening. Let's go back to 80% and you can see the difference here. I will cancel that. Let's look at what will affect the size and position of the shadow itself. Let's select the three layers and press P for position, select the light, and if you move the light on its x-axis, you notice that the shadow will respond and position itself according where you positioned the light. If you move it also further up, let's say, it will go down, of course, depending on the position of the light. If you put it in the middle here, I'm giving you some examples of movement. If you move the light closer to your layer, the shadow, of course, is going to become bigger. Let's position it a bit up and work with the z-axis. If you bring your z-axis and reduce the value to bring it near your layers, of course, your shadow is going to become bigger. If then, on the contrary, you take it away from your layer, you push your light back, then the shadow will become smaller and smaller, as you can see. If then you take it very far away, the shadow will position itself right behind your layer and it will not be visible unless you're using a different camera and you're complicating things. Let's undo. So you notice how the x-axis, y-axis and the z-axis for the light will determine the size of your shadow. So the position of your light according to the layer that is casting the shadow and the layer receiving the shadow will determine the position, the shape and the size of your shadow. That is one of the factors. The position of the layer casting the shadow in relation to the position of the layer accepting the shadow and the lights also affect the position and the size of the shadow itself. Let's take a different view here. Let's look at two views, horizontal for example, and in this one, the left one, we will choose the left view. You notice where your light is. I will try to adjust it a bit, fine, and bring it nearer to the layer casting the shadow. Now you see there is already a difference. If you move that layer, then of course the shadow will move and will reflect differently on the layer receiving the shadow. Moving the layer on this z-axis, getting nearer to the layer receiving the shadows, of course will affect and make the shadow a bit smaller. So this is the factors for moving the shadow according to the layer casting the shadow. I will undo. The layer receiving the shadows also plays a big role on the shape and the position of the shadow. Let's for example take the top view and we have our two shadows in perspective. If we open a rotation for the background and scrub on the y-axis using orientation, you know that smaller is the distance between the two layers casting and receiving the shadows, smaller is the shadow. Let's scale up the background. I press S to bring the scale and make it quite big to cover all the composition. You notice also higher the distance in relative to the light and the two layers, the bigger is the shadow. If you scrub through and get it very near, for example, you notice now the shadow on one side is very small and on the other side is very big. Let's try to put the shadow on the floor. We have to create the floor first. So I will reset the background, give it a next rotation of 270 degrees. Let's change the view to left, fine. We drag our layer down and we stretch it up to start, reaching near shadow, the word shadow. I will take shadow down now. So we do some adjustment, take the layer down a bit so you can start seeing the shadow. Put the light in a way where it's pushing the shadow very far because I want to introduce a camera. I will put a new camera and 35mm will do. Now I will do some adjustment with the camera. It is not like I prepared this one, so I'm gonna do it with you here. And we move the camera in a way where we can see the shadow layer and its shadows. So I'm moving the point to see exactly where can I fit it. It's working a bit, fine. We move the light back. And here you are, you can see already the shadow coming up. I will introduce another light because I want to show you how to use the darkness. So I will go to layer, new light. I will use an ambient light, that will be enough. And the intensity, I'm going to reduce it to 15, for example, only. Here you are, your scene is brighter, but our point is to use the shallow darkness. So I brought in the first light and I will increase the darkness. And you notice how your shadow has become quite dark. I can really make it dark. So this is how you use the shadow darkness against other lights. Now let's look at shadow diffusion. If I put shadow diffusion a bit higher, not much, because shadow diffusion is quite intensive on rendering. Let's say we give it 15. Let's see, not bad. I'll make it quite big so you notice the difference. If you have a very good processor, then it will be easy to render. But usually 30 will be not bad. That's it. Okay, we get it back to. In the background here, I will open orientation, that's rotation, and I want to change the angle here to cover the whole screen. Notice it's quite beautiful. Let's open the scale also and make it bigger so it covers everything. Here you are. Now you notice that the layer shallow is not touching the ground according to here. So I'm simply gonna take it and take it down to touch the ground. Here is touching. I move it up on the line. Okay, here you are. If you take the light down, the shadow will glow. You can move it forward a bit. Here you are. So now the shadows adjust. You can also push your layer behind, take it down so it can touch again, and have it in the middle of your screen. So there is not much adjustment to do, but every time you do a change, you have to ensure that your layer is touching the ground here or the other layer. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you go out and open After Effects and do your work and do a lot of manipulation.